The soil doesn't care about a man's pride. It doesn't remember the 50 years Arthur Miller spent sweating into its deep, stubborn clay, nor does it grant mercy just because his boots are thin and his knees are broken. Arthur stood at the edge of the east pasture, watching the dust kick up in low, violent spirals under the afternoon heat. In his weather-beaten hand, he clutched a crumpled piece of white paper. It was a formal eviction notice from Blackwood Financial, printed with cold, mechanical precision. He had exactly 7 days. 7 days before the bank auctioned off the 120 acres his grandfather had cleared by hand. 7 days before Arthur, at 72 years old, became a ghost with nowhere to haunt. He didn't cry. Tears required water, and Arthur felt completely dried out, inside and out. He turned his back on the cracked earth and walked slowly toward the rotting porch of the homestead, the heavy silence of the valley wrapping around him like a shroud. Inside, the house smelled of old oak, stale coffee, and decades of forgotten memories. With no family left, his wife, Clara, had passed 6 winters ago, and they had never been blessed with children. Arthur was the last line of defense. But defense required money, and the bank wanted $80,000 in back taxes and predatory interest that had accumulated since the draft hit 3 years ago. He walked into the parlor, where his grandfather's heavy iron-bound trunk sat in the corner, half buried under dusty wool blankets. Arthur had passed that trunk 10,000 times. It was supposed to hold old tax ledgers from the 1930s, broken hand tools, and worthless homesteading permits. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, crimson fingers across the floorboards, a strange compulsion took hold of him. He didn't want to leave anything behind for the bailiffs. If he was going down, he was going to take his family's history with him. He knelt, his joints popping in the quiet room, and hauled the heavy lid open. Creak. The scent of ancient paper and dried lavender filled the air. Arthur pulled out yellowed newspapers, rusty horseshoes, and faded receipts. But near the very bottom, tucked under a loose cedar floor liner that felt oddly raised, his trembling fingers brushed against something stiff. It wasn't paper. It was thick, oil-treated parchment, sealed inside a heavy tin tube that had rusted shut over the decades. Arthur's heart took a strange, erratic leap. He grabbed a pair of pliers from his workbench, jammed the tip into the seal, and twisted until the cap snapped off with a sharp, metallic ring. He pulled out the document. It was covered in faded cursive handwriting, stamped with an official state seal from 1898, and signed by the state governor himself. Arthur dragged the parchment under the dim yellow light of his kitchen lamp, squinting through his smudged reading glasses. As he read the archaic legal jargon, his breath caught in his throat. The document wasn't a land deed or a tax record. It was an ancient, perpetual easement and resource grant executed between the original county founders and Arthur's grandfather, Elijah Miller. According to the explicitly written terms, the state had granted Elijah's land an absolute immunity from county seizure in exchange for a massive, unfulfilled public debt the town owed the Miller family after the Great Flood of 1897. More importantly, buried in Section 4 of the document, was a clause regarding the natural springs running beneath the property line, a clause that explicitly granted the owner total mineral and commercial rights to the entire underground aquifer feeding the county's primary water grid. For decades, the town's massive utility corporation had been drawing millions of gallons of water from beneath Arthur's feet, selling it back to the residents, while telling Arthur his land was barren and worthless. The document proved that the corporation had been operating illegally on Miller land for over 80 years, accruing millions in uncollected royalties. Arthur sat in the quiet kitchen, the document resting beneath his calloused hands. His heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. He wasn't just broke, he was sitting on a legal powder keg that could ruin the very bank trying to starve him out. But as he stared closer at the bottom of the parchment, he noticed a second signature written in fresh, dark blue ink right beside his grandfather's faded quill signature, a signature dated only 10 years ago. Someone else knew this document existed. And someone had tried to make sure Arthur never opened that trunk. Arthur stared at the fresh signature in stunned silence. The name written beside his grandfather's was clear as day, Julian Blackwood. The founder of Blackwood Financial, the very man whose son was currently trying to seize his farm. The piece of paper wasn't just a lost historical grant, it was evidence of a massive, multi-generational conspiracy. 10 years ago, when Arthur's father was fading in a hospice bed, Julian Blackwood had come into this house under the guise of an old family friend offering a minor loan. He had found the document, quietly added his signature as a co-claimant through a fraudulent notary stamp, and then hidden it back in the trunk, waiting for Arthur to go bankrupt so Blackwood Financial could claim the land without raising suspicion. Suddenly, heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. Headlights flashed through the kitchen window, cutting through the dark. Arthur stood up, carefully slid the parchment into his coat pocket, and opened the door. Standing on the porch was Thomas Blackwood, the sharp-suited CEO of Blackwood Financial, holding a briefcase and accompanied by 2 local sheriff's deputies. Thomas smiled, though his eyes remained icy cold. "Arthur," Thomas said, stepping up to the doorway. "We're here to offer you a quick way out. Sign the voluntary surrender papers tonight, and I'll throw in $20,000 cash so you don't end up on the street. Otherwise, the deputies carry you off on Monday." Arthur didn't flinch. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out the oil-treated parchment, holding it up under the porch light. Thomas's smile instantly evaporated. His face drained of color as his gaze locked onto his father's stolen signature. "You were never going to sell this land to developers," Arthur said softly, his voice steadying. "You wanted the aquifer rights. Your father stole this claim, but he forgot one thing: an easement without a recorded public filing expires after 100 years unless activated by the direct bloodline. My bloodline. You don't own this farm, Thomas. Your company owes my family $80 million in stolen water royalties." Thomas took an aggressive step forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "No judge in this county will accept a dusty piece of paper over our bank records, old man. Give it to me, or you won't live to see Monday." The 2 deputies stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. But before anyone could move, Arthur reached into his other pocket and pulled out his cracked cellular phone. The screen was lit up. "I don't need a local judge," Arthur said coldly. "The State Attorney General's Fraud Division has been on speakerphone for the last 5 minutes. They heard every word, Thomas." The silence that followed was suffocating. The deputies immediately stepped back, their faces pale as they realized the scale of the trap. Thomas stood frozen, his briefcase slipping slightly in his hand as the realization hit him that his family empire had just crumbled into dust on a rotting porch. 3 months later, the sun rose high over the east pasture. The eviction notice was gone, replaced by state conservation markers protecting the land for generations to come. The debt was wiped, the bank was under federal investigation, and Arthur stood on his porch holding a hot cup of coffee. He walked down the steps and knelt beside the soil, running his thick, earth-stained fingers through the warm, dark earth that had almost been stolen from him. For the first time in 3 years, the dry wind blew, and the soft sound of rain began to patter against the oak trees. Arthur closed his eyes, smiled through his tears, and whispered into the quiet morning wind, "We made it, Clara. The farm is finally home."